We have to turn Japanese. What we've done in the West is reproduce the same mistakes the Japanese did, and have still been living in those mistakes for 25 years now, and we've actually let ourselves walk into exactly the same trap, and are focusing on exactly the same wrong issues that the Japanese have focused upon for the last 25 years. So if you look at the Japanese crisis, and it began virtually on the first day of 1990, it's quite ironic that the Nikkei index peaked at, I think, about 38,500 or maybe even 39,500 points on the 31st of December 1989. And it's been downhill and up gale occasionally ever since. I think it's about, 17,000 points now, so it's been low as 7,000. But they'll never talk about it reaching a new high. It's been that depressed from 40,000 points down to where it is now for 25 years. Now, if you look at what people say, what's the problem with Japan, they'll tell you it's public debt. And this is the profile of the red line is private debt in Japan. The blue line is public debt. And everybody is focusing upon this one, which is this rising level of public debt. Note that it starts rising after 1990. And in very superficial thinking, the sort of thing that will get you elected Prime Minister, you might say that that's what's causing the problem. We've got a reduced level of public debt. Nobody focuses upon this one. Now the situation in Japan is that where private debt was literally 2.5 times, close to 3 times, the level of public debt when the crisis began. Now public debt is substantially higher than private debt, but everybody's focus is on this line. Still, you don't see anyone really talking about the level of private debt in Japan. Well, my argument, which I've taken a while to refine, is that in a market economy, in a credit-driven economy, demand is a sum of demand and income generated out of existing money, plus demand and income generated by newly created money, which is normally created by debt. So the change in debt plays a major role in both income and demand. And therefore, when you have an economy with a large rate of growth of debt, you will have a large rate of growth of demand. Pardon me. But of course that includes rising debt, which can lead to the point where people stop borrowing money, start going bankrupt, you have a Minsking crisis. This is now looking at that. The red line now is the change in private debt per year in Japan as a percentage of GDP. The blue line is the unemployment rate, and to make the correlation more obvious, you see it's minus 0.91. I've turned the unemployment rate upside down. So that's unemployment from 1% at the top, 6% at the bottom. And 1965 to now, the correlation is minus 0.91. Now, according to Ben Bernanke, that should be roughly 0. So conventional economists ignore the importance of private debt completely. My argument, and I'll elaborate a bit more later, is that the change in private debt gave us the peak level of demand coming right up to 1990. The collapse in the level of change in debt since that stage on has been what's driven the economy down, and we've now had, in this Japan's case, about 15 years where most of the time the level of private debt has been falling, which is actually taking demand out of the economy. Of course, they've got huge trade surplus to pump it back in there, and also the government sector borrowing and spending as well, pumping demand back in. But the primary problem they're facing is that the reduction in private debt is pulling money out of the economy and pulling demand out of the economy. Now, this is the American data. Pardon me. And I'm showing all three, the private government debt down the bottom, private debt here, and then the total of the two up the top. I will come back to another version of this chart slightly later on. Notice the same pattern. Public debt starts to rise after the crisis. Shortly after the crisis, the level of private debt starts to fall. So again, what's the same causal link? The next chart will now show you the correlation between change in private debt as a percentage of GDP and the level of unemployment in America, again turning the unemployment upside down on the right-hand side of the graph so I can graph the two together. And I know the old cliche that, I often find the argument that correlation is not causation is used as a cliche to dismiss a causal argument. I've got a causal argument here. Okay, the change in debt drives demand, and this is correlation confirming that. Getting a correlation of minus 0.93 between two variables over 25 years in anything in economics should have people's jaws on the floor. It certainly had mine when I first plotted it. That is the role that change in debt plays in driving the economy. We had a period where, at the peak in 2006, 2007, the change in private debt was adding 15% per annum to total demand in the economy. That demand being spent both on goods and services and also assets. So when you have a financial vision of the economy, and of course anybody who studied economics knows that mainstream economists do not have a financial vision of the economy. But if you have a monetary vision of the economy, then you spend money both on buying goods and services and assets. So you've got to include that on the demand side as well. But effectively 15% additional demand was going into the economy, being spent on both goods and services and assets. Before the crisis, at its very peak, at the very bottom, the reduction in private debt was reducing demand by 5% per annum. And now you're back to the stage where it's running at about 5 or 6% per annum. I don't think we'll ever see it getting back to this level again when it comes back to what the current level of debt is and how it compares to what we've seen in past history. Now, England is slightly more complicated. That's a good thing, because you wouldn't want to be as simple as the Americans, would you? Mainly because you've got an unbelievably large financial sector. The red line is data taken from the ONS, which includes the borrowing of the non-bank financial sector from the banks. The blue line is comparable to what the American data has, which is just non-financial sector borrowing. So that's a combination of household borrowing and also borrowing by non-financial corporations. And the black line, government debt, again the same basic pattern. Rising level up until slightly after the crisis, then declining. Public debt starts to rise after the crisis. Again, the political debate is all on this one, which, as we've seen for the last, for both America and England, is the smaller level of debt. If you had a medical approach saying, looking at a couple of indicators, which one would you worry about more? I think you'd worry about the bigger one. But economists completely ignore the level of private debt. They don't even know that it matters. Now, looking again at the same idea, the change in private debt and the level of unemployment in England, it's a more volatile relationship, but still a pretty stunning correlation. That's looking at change in the private non-financial sector debt. Doing the same chart again with the financial sector debt, you get maybe incredible levels of change in private debt according to the ONS data. I still can't quite believe this number, but it tells me that in 2009 the change in private debt, including financial sector debt, was equivalent to 60% of GDP. You guys are in the hottest speculative bubble on the planet. There's no other country comes close to that. So why did mainstream economists ignore private debt? And I've had plenty of confrontations with, I slowly began to realise why they think they can ignore it. And it comes back to this model they call loanable funds. And my favourite foil in economics, of course, is Paul Krugman. If anybody saw the debate I had with him a couple of years ago, this is a quote from his book, End This Depression Now, which I think he might retitle these days, End This Depression Tomorrow. He says, think of it this way, when the debt's rising, it's not the economy as a whole borrowing more money. So it's rather a case of less patient people borrowing from more patient people. And this is the Tobin model that came out of the 1950s, turning over a consensus in economics up to that stage. And Richard Verner does a very good job of describing that consensus, the pre-Second World War consensus, by the way, in a couple of recent papers. That banks create money and that money creates demand. And you can find that in Pigou, of all people. It isn't just in Keynes or Schumpeter. It was widespread acceptance, that view. It's the neoclassical, the American neoclassicals, post the Second World War, have driven that out of thinking. And of course the reality, and here again, thank God you're not the Americans, you'd have the Federal Reserve. You've got the Bank of England instead. And I doff my cap very happily to the bank for publishing this beautiful paper I'm sure most of you have seen from the beginning of last year about money creation in the modern economy. And they might as well have addressed this to Paul Krugman, except that he actually said, I think he also colour me puzzled, I think he described his particular blog post there. He couldn't see why people thought this was a significant article. They're pretty much telling him, Paul, bank lending creates money. And that money effectively creates demand as well. So what I found, I often find if you're trying to communicate a concept to an orthodoxy that doesn't comprehend the concept, the best thing is to build their concept in your framework and then show how easy it is to change across to the real world. So what I've done, and I'll bring up this model in my Minsky program here, is I effectively took the model of banking that Krugman and Egerton Krugman and Egerton had in their Quarterly Journal of Economics paper, which was patient lends to impatient. And in this model, the patient sector was the consumer goods sector, the impatient sector is the investment sector. So I have them both. I have the consumer sector, pardon me. I hope I haven't caused the program to crash, they'll soon find out. The consumer sector lending money to the investment sector and then charging interest on it. And the bank simply plays the role of an intermediary which charges a fee for the lending. So I set their model up and then run their model. Notice the rate of growth here tapers along towards zero. I've now got a couple of controls here where I can change the rate of lending. So if I speed lending up, economy slows down a bit, strangely enough. If I slow down repayment, economy also slows down. That model's been running for 25 years now, and GDP has been flatlining at about 200. You can see the level of debt rising dramatically compared to the money supply. And if I can bring in a graph showing the, let's see, debt to GDP ratio, I think it's further down here somewhere. Pardon me. That's why I'm looking forward to the day of high resolution monitors becoming normal. So I'm going to have to do this. But the debt ratio rising quite dramatically. I'll keep on running the model for a bit longer with these high settings. And notice the GDP is not growing. It's not shrinking either. There's no crash going on. Let's stop it for a moment and I'll just show that debt ratio again. So the debt ratio is past 110% of GDP now, rising away. What's happened to GDP itself with rising debt? Nothing. Now if I change those controls, continue running the model, but have lending happening much more slowly and repayment much more rapidly. Bit of a spurt in level of growth there. But with those dramatic changes in level of lending, what's happened to GDP? After 52 years, bugger all. Okay? Little ups and downs. So from this point of view, the model point that they have, you can ignore debt. It has a trivial impact, a second order impact on the level of output in GDP. So a huge growth in the level of debt, a huge plunge, nothing much happens to the economy, you can ignore debt. So that's encapsulating the vision that the neoclassicals have in general of the role of banks and why you can ignore the private sector borrowing. They only worry about the government sector. But the myth they have here is that debt is an asset of the consumer sector, as if the consumer sector lends to the investment sector. No, banks lend to non-banks. So let's just correct that. So I'm going to delete the debt as being shown as an asset of the consumer sector. Delete all the lending operations here because you don't repay money between the consumer sector and the investment sector. You pay the money to the bank. Whoops. Changing a couple of levels here as well. And then come across to the banking sector and say, in fact, the debt is an asset of the bank. It's always dangerous doing these things live because you can make a mistake without realising you've done it and everything crashes. We'll soon see how I go here. So I've now simply set up the real world that you borrow money from a bank, you repay the bank, you pay the bank interest. There's no such thing as paying a bank's fee, or there's not an intermediation fee isn't a major issue. Stop the system, go back to my starting levels and run it again and see what happens. Notice the rate of growth is somewhat higher. And if I now have an increase in the rate of lending and a decrease in the rate of repayment, so take longer to repay, you get an absolute boom in the economy. You can see GDPs are rising dramatically. If you now have a slowdown in the rate of lending, and an increase in the rate of repayment, you can see it on the bottom here, GDP starts to plunge. I'll go back to the original situation again. And let's take a look at that graph of GDP in a moment. Changes in the level of debt and rate of growth of debt have a dramatic impact upon the macroeconomy. So it's quite simple to go from their vision of the reason you can ignore the banking sector to the real world of saying banks lend money, guys. That's the actual role they have. They create money by doing it, and that money, when it's injected into the economy, is creating demand at the same time. I'll just show you that graph now of GDP down the bottom here. So you've had a boom and a slump on the economy because of an increase and decrease in the rate of growth of debt. Now, I haven't got Minsky effects going on here. I've got all the money effectively being repaid successfully. But changes in the rate of growth of the private sector debt have a dramatic impact upon the economy, and that's what the neoclassicals are ignoring. So by just simply bringing in the real world, that it's not non-banks that lend to other non-banks, but banks that lend to non-banks, you go from the world I'm showing you, pardon me, on the left-hand side there, where you can pretty much ignore changes in debt, to the right-hand side, where changes in debt have a dramatic impact upon the economy as a whole. So that's why they ignore it, and that's why the institutional battle over whether banks lend money or not, which is absurd to even have to have that debate. It shows how asinine the mainstream is that you need to argue that point with them. Winning that debate's important, but also saying it's not just an institutional thing, it's also macroeconomic. That has a major impact upon the rate of growth of the economy. So that's why they ignore it, that's why they're wrong. And because they're ignoring it, and this is coming back to some of the discussion that Anne Pettifor was having earlier today, talking about interest rates and so on, they don't think that changing the interest rate has much of an impact upon demand as a total, because it means that people who save earn more money, and people who have debt pay more interest out, and one cancels out the other. So they're not expecting an increase in the rate of interest to have much impact. What it will do is mean that debtors don't borrow as much money anymore, the rate of growth of debt will slow down, and the economy will tank. So they're going to, most likely, if they try to raise the interest rate in America, they're likely to stop the recovery in its tracks very, very rapidly. And the reason that matters now, but it wasn't the case, say, in 1990, even though interest rates were falling from 1980 on, is because of the aggregate level of debt in the economy. And again, they're aware of the level of government debt. The blue line data you can see there, you can download from the Congress office in the States, going right back actually to 1790, the level of public debt in America. I managed to construct a time series of private debt going back to 1834 by taking the Federal Reserve's definition from 1950 on, 1945 on when you use annual data, and then tacking it on to census data for loans and then census data for a subset of banks back to 1834. So I think that's a reasonable comparison of the level of private debt now to during the Great Depression. Now, the aggregate line there as well is something I put in because Richard Vague, who's a colleague of mine who's a leading banker, ex-banker, and now also a critic of financialisation, emphasises that it isn't just a case of saying let's swap public debt for private debt. We've got to reduce debt in general. And what we have had, as you look over the very long term, is an increase in the level of total debt, but certainly the driving factor has been this rising level of private debt. Now, the American recovery is trying to start from this point when the debt ratio is about 145% of GDP. The last big recovery began back in 1992-93 when it was about 105%, 110% of GDP. So the headroom here, pardon me, for rising private debt to stimulate the economy is incredibly limited. And that's the same situation Japan has been in all the way through. You simply will not get much private borrowing, but people go back to deleveraging again, which is why I say the recovery is doomed. It can't, if you look at this length of time here between the bottom of the recession of the 1990s to the peak of the boom before the crisis began, you're looking at about 15 years. There was a bit of a recession in 2000 with the NASDAQ crash, but you had pretty much 15 years of growing private debt, stimulating the economy. As the corporate sector borrowing declined in America with the crash of the dot-com crash. The subprime bubble was taking over at the same time. It's quite intriguing to see the pattern there. You're not going to get 15 years of rising debt, because in that case you get up to levels of 180, 200% of GDP. And because America runs a trade deficit, and slightly now runs a payments deficit as well, they can't carry the same level of debt that China has or that Japan has done. So I can see this, I simply can't see them getting back to the previous level, and I can't see them lasting more than 5 years, but they're likely to shoot themselves in the foot by putting interest rates up once they get that level of the participation rate Anne was talking about, 62%, and the unemployment rate down a bit. They may think they've got to control potential inflation, and what they'll do is take the debt stimulus out of the economy and we'll head down again. So I think the only way out of this crisis is a debt cancellation. And what I see us as being in is a debt deflation attenuated by the level of government deficit spending. Of course, the great danger is governments believe the responsible management is to reduce the deficit, preferably run a surplus. That's why we're seeing 25% rates of unemployment, not just in Greece, which you can partially blame on the Greeks and the way that the Europeans are delighting in doing right now. You can't do that for the Spanish. They've got the same level of unemployment. So without the deficit spending of the government sector, we would have a 25% unemployment rates like we had during the Great Depression, and like the Spanish have now. And this is a model, again, done in by Minsky software, but where I simulate a private sector economy without that capacity of a government sector to spend money in the opposite direction. And you have a period where everything seems to be going along quite nicely, nice equilibrium rate of profit growth, you're ignoring the rate of growth of private debt, and then the economy goes to hell in a handbasket because the level of debt completely overwhelms the economy, economic activity collapses. That's the basic pattern we've got ourselves locked in, with only government spending, deficit spending, preventing us going down that tube. And of course, in Europe, they don't have the benefit of that. So I think the only way we can get out of this is by debt cancellation, without writing off a large amount of the debt, particularly private, but also public. We're never going to reach pre-crisis levels of credit growth, and you do need, leaving out the ecological issues, which was a huge thing to leave out, but I have to do that to make this argument. A normal growing capitalist economy has a substantial part of its demand financed by growth of money, which is mainly growth of debt. Now, if you can't get growth of debt, you're not going to get a vibrant economy. So you're going to have stagnation, you're going to have what the neoclassicals are calling secular stagnation. It's actually debt stagnation, because the level of debt finance demand simply can't reach the level it needs to be to give you full employment. So we're always going to be on the edge, of the Japanese have been for 25 years now, of deleveraging. All it will take is the public sector being stupid enough, and of course obviously they're stupid enough, to get back into trying to run a surplus, to trigger the private sector to have to then start reducing its own borrowing, and the economy then goes down because both the private sector and the government are taking money out of the economy. The whole thing collapses. Japan's been doing that for a quarter of a century, and that's feasible in Japan because it's a cohesive society, and they've been doing enormous government stimulus at the same time. Now we're talking about non-cohesive societies in the West, with governments obsessed with running surpluses. I don't think we're going to get a quarter of a century of still relative prosperity as Japan has had. We're likely to continue dropping back into a crisis again. The only way I see out of it is what I call a modern debt jubilee, which is to use the state's capacity to create money to cancel private debt by giving all citizens, all companies, a direct cash injection directly into their bank accounts, requiring those who are in debt to pay their debt down. But of course those who aren't in debt get a cash injection. So you don't benefit savers over borrowers or borrowers over savers. And you also can attenuate this to the level of demand you need in the economy at the same time. But we've got to reduce that debt level. But also have to reform the banking sector, and I'll put deliberately in and other miracles. I know how difficult that is. But a banking sector that creates money by financing asset bubbles is a large part of our problem. The vision of banking that makes sense is the vision Schumpeter had, that bankers provide capital for entrepreneurs. They don't even provide capital for the corner shop anymore. You don't have overdrafts anymore. Firms don't get lines of credit. They issue commercial paper because the banks made it too expensive. It's cheaper for the banks to finance asset bubbles than to actually finance proper investment. So we need to force them back into providing what they should provide, which is entrepreneurial finance. And one element of that I've talked about, I call the pill. Trying to find a decent acronym always helps. I know England's obsessed with acronyms, I'm sure it'll go down well here, for all sorts of reasons. I have what I call property income limited leverage. So rather than just having the alleged level of leverage based on the income of the borrower, which is a piece of nonsense they use to have an elastic band to decide how much money to lend to you for buying a property which they're sure is going to rise in price, have another limit set on the income earning capacity of the property being purchased. And my usual example is to say have like a factor of 10. So if you had a place which rented for £50,000 a year, the maximum anybody could borrow to buy it would be £500,000, which would then to some extent tie lending to the level of income rather than the level of asset price appreciation. And I'd also ban margin lending. I think that's an insane activity, and it hasn't caused quite as many suicides as it did during the Great Depression. That may indeed be a pity, but let's get rid of the capacity to speculate on shares. We've got to change the nature of shares as well. And I think we also have to see a way of, we have to accept one little issue that's sometimes hard to accept from a progressive point of view. What banks should do is difficult and risky. They should be lending to entrepreneurs. But how do you know the person you're lending to is going to be the next Dyson? Okay? If you lend money to an entrepreneur who's got a great idea for a vacuum cleaner and he gets wiped out by Dyson, you lose the entire loan, and the only upside for you is the interest on the loan. Something that we could borrow to some extent from the Islamic finance idea is that the lender should be a risk sharer in the venture, but should also share in the upside. So one suggestion I'm floating here is the idea of what I call entrepreneurial equity loans. So a loan that's given to an entrepreneur which involves the bank getting an equity share in the business. And effectively that's saying money creation for venture capitalist purchases, for purposes not for asset bubbles. Something like that means there's an upside to the banks for backing 10 entrepreneurs, 9 of whom are going to lose money, 1 of whom might succeed. Then at least you might get creative lending and the bank gets a positive upside for that. It doesn't get wiped out by the downside on the 9 that fail. Thank you.